Welcome to Season 33 of Penny Dreadful. It is currently looking like Eorian Piles versus Lurrus Piles, specifically Eorian Orzhov versus White Weenie and Boros Legends. We lost most of the cards that made blue good this season in Season 32, and we also lost Crackling Ray, Kiki Jiki, and Lamplight Phoenix, as well as Pyroclasm. So the Izzet are a lot worse. We also lost Dark Ritual, so combo is probably not going to be very good, or it's going to be fringe, or people will play bad combo decks because that's the only thing we have. Brave the Elements is out. White Weenie will probably get stronger regardless. Sanctum Weaver is out, but Enchantress is still probably a deck. It's definitely doable. I'm not sure if people will play it though. Valiant Rescuer and Tyrannus Stinger, as well as some other cycling cards, are out. Agrocide is still possible, but a lot worse. We are getting Thalia for the first time, which makes White Weenie a lot better, as well as Boros Legends. Basically, on the play against Eorian deck, they can't Tithing Blade or Saw Blade, so it's like almost a time lock if you're on the play. And basically just removal in general gets a lot worse. Non-creature decks in general. Lurrus is returning for both decks, although White Weenie can play Elite Spellbinder and Benalish Marshal instead. Lurrus gives a lot of longevity to both of the decks, especially Boros Legends. Luminarch Aspirant for White Weenie. It probably pushes White Weenie away from soldiers like Valiant Veteran. They have Lurrus, so they can't play the 3-drop anyway. Path to Exile, mostly for White Weenie, but for Boros Legends and any white deck, pretty much, as well. Gideon, not really an aggro card. It's possible that some mid-range deck wants him, but it's possible he also just isn't good anywhere, in any good decks, I should say. Requisition Raid could be main decked in White Weenie as a Basri Solidarity. That's also a sorcery wear tear, and will probably be sideboarded in Boros Legends. I think Boros Legends is a little bit stronger than White Weenie, although I think it's pretty close because we didn't get Chain Lightning. And the mana is a little questionable without Thran Portal. The Rock gets quite a few things this season. Bob is probably the main thing that interests most people. We're finally getting the former modern staple. It's interesting to see if he's actually good or if he just dies to removal. He's also kind of bad against aggro, since he loses life. And it seems like every deck is going to be either aggro or removal heavy. But it could be good regardless. Pest Infestation, great sideboard card, potentially main deckable as well. It commits crimes. It was main deck artifact Enchantment Hate. It's a sorcery Secure the Waste. It's good with Vraska. And speaking of Vraska, she is finally in PD. And she's not very good with most of these cards for her +2, except Pest Infestation and potentially Bob if you want to save life. But I think she is a very good card for midrange in general, so she'll be playable regardless. Glissa basically never loses combats, and also gets to draw cards with some other upsides when you connect. Scavenging Ooze is Graveyard Hate for Lurrus decks that also gains life for Dark Confidant and commits crimes. Erupt Decay, probably the best removal spell in the format, better than Path in my opinion, but it's probably only playable in one deck, and that's Golgari midrange because no one else really wants to be in Golgari. Basically hits everything from the aggro decks, including Flowering or any other artifacts and enchantments they might want, and gets around the Flowering tax. Murderous Rider, interesting for black midrange, probably not amazing, but maybe played as a 2-of or something. Offsets Bob, notably. Calling Ritual, probably a sideboard card for against Boros Legends and White Weenie. It might actually win the matchup. Maybe the reason they're favored, maybe it makes them heavily favored. Free Strider Lookout is the reason you want to be committing crimes. Basically, it puts a ton of lands in play, which I don't think is super relevant if you're just playing this proc deck. Because I think you want to be fairly low to the ground for Dark Confidant. It does make mana for Pest Infestation, and you are drawing cards with Bob. So you want mana for that, but I think mostly you want to play it with Field of the Dead, which we are getting this season. It's pretty easy to trigger 2 crimes, or trigger this twice a turn, especially with skews. And that does just win the mid-range mirror, potentially wins the Yorion matchups, so you could potentially beat both the Lurrus decks and the Yorion decks, which is exactly where you want to be this season. Could make it the best deck, because basically to be the best deck you need to be able to beat both Yorion and Lurrus aggro, I believe. Big things to cheat out. I think you mostly just want Worldspine Worm if you aren't using the graveyard. It's a massive creature, only really loses to Path and similar. Good with Through the Breach, does 50 damage, makes 3 5/5s. If you are animating with Reenact or Dread Return, you get Itali, I think. You could get Iona as well, which is returning. Or it was legal in Season 32. Itali, probably the best thing to cheat out with Reenact or Dread Return, which I don't think are very good this season, but it's interesting to note. This is probably the best reanimation we've ever gotten, though maybe Iona is still the best. Yorion will probably be really good this season. I expect it will not be as good as Season 31, but I do think it could be the best deck this season, probably just as Orzhov. And the reason I think it's not quite as good is Price of Progress mainly. Boros Legends potentially wins the matchup against Yorion piles now. Price of Progress is also good against the Field of the Dead decks. Basically just auto wins against them. Greasefang, I don't think it's that good. It loses to Path, it loses to Abrupt Decay. But it's interesting. I think it's not very good against Yorion because they just answer the Angels after you reanimate. But it could be interesting. Hardened Scales, we have Arcbound Revenger and Friends, except for Zabaz, which is a pretty big blow. You do get Lurrus and Selesnya. Good Brain String, probably not as good as White Weenie or Boros Legends. If blue is good this season, it is because of Haudijin. We lost basically every good blue card, so now we have to rely on No More Lies for our best counterspell, unless you want to play like Spell Pierce, Phantom Interference, Forbid, which are not great. They're a lot worse than Mana Leak. So you might want to be Azorius if you're playing blue just for this. Sleight of Hand is a really good cantrip outside of like Cyclers. So you might want to be some kind of Azorius tempo deck if you're playing blue. Storming Entity is probably bad, since it's really just Sleight of Hand that lets you play it on turn 3. Insidious Roots triggers off a lot of things. I don't know if it's going to really do anything because it really has, most of the decks that trigger it are only going to work because of Insidious Roots, and if you don't draw roots, your deck probably won't be very good. It's good with Hogak. It's good with creatures that recur themselves. It's good with Dredge. It's good with any way of exiling cards from your yard for a cost. So it's interesting to see if Roots is a deck this season. Nissa, we don't have Rofello, so Mono Green Ramp is probably not very good. I could see play in other green mid-range decks, but I kind of doubt it. Potentially it's the reason those decks are good, if they are though. Azorius Yorion could be a deck. Probably not as good as Orzhov, but you can play Thassa as a slightly better teleportation circle. Arguably worse, because it doesn't hit Tithing Blade and Saw Blades. Probably Saw Blades because you're Azorius. And Wizards as well probably wants to be Izzet, and they still get teleportation circle despite not being in white. That could be interesting. I don't think Wizards is good though. Vannifar combos with Pestermites and similar. I'm not sure if there's a win that doesn't just make a bunch of hasty creatures, which would take a lot of slots, but it does do a lot of things if it untaps with any creature. Shatterfang for game objects. I don't think those decks are going to be good at all. Shatterfang's interesting for them though. Soul Perdition, we have Path to Exile and Fateful Absence this season. So it could be interesting there. Or instead of those. But probably not, because I think they're better. Field of the Dead is probably going to be impactful this season. I'm not sure how impactful. I've seen it compared to Cloudpost as a slow deck killer that's terrible into good decks mostly, with really polarized matchups. I think that it could be good in Golgari with Free Strider. Look out. I think this deck could be really good with Field of the Dead. But you might not want to play it because of Price of Progress. I think it's potentially playable in like Eorian decks as well, just to win the mirror or beat up on mid-range decks even harder, or for any mid-range deck if they want to be Eorian piles. For our returning cards, we have Spectre Shriek as the sideboard card to deal with combo for black decks. Combo is probably Fringe, but it's a catch-all for those Fringe decks. Blackmail, probably not very good outside of discard decks, which probably don't exist. Not really a sideboard card though. Lake for Midnight Mass, maybe other black decks that want a lot of mana, mono black. If they play Lightning Rift, they don't get Lake though, most likely. Isamaru is the reason Boros Legends can be really good this season. It's just legendary one drop, the best one, probably. Kill Fiend, we don't have the cheap blue and red cards mostly. We don't have Chain. I don't think it's very good into the removal heavy format that I expect this to be, but it's interesting to note. Ravenous Squirrel for beam objects, aristocrats, something probably playable in bad decks, but maybe they're good. Shardless Agent, probably not good for Glimpse because they want to discover. Hypergenesis is probably bad, but it definitely wants Shardless. And then there's mostly this Trickery deck that people are interested in with Primal Surge that wins the game by going Shardless into Trickery into Primal Surge and putting the new deserts that do 1 damage to target opponent when they enter. Or you could do the old way of making a big hasty creature. And there's also Field of the Dead, which could be relevant for that deck. It can crash the game if you play too many of them, so you might just have to play one. I'm not sure what it actually does. It's only if they are somehow able to beat your other win con. That is all. I do think that this is going to be Eorian piles versus Laris aggro, potentially with some rock, but it's interesting to see if people can do anything with Haughty Djinn, or maybe something else like Hardened Scales, really anything else. I did exclude a lot of potentially interesting cards, so maybe something I didn't mention at all is the best deck. I'm interested to see what happens in Season 33. It is currently been out for like 12 hours, 13, and people are playing a lot of White Weenie. I have seen some rock, mostly White Weenie it looks like, so it's probably going to be more popular in Boros Legends. That's what I expect from this season.